Welcome to Realcast, the weekly roundup of the real asset markets. I'm joined this week by Dan Innes and Paul Strome. Of course, this week we saw the Fed raise interest rates by 75 basis points. So a lot of focus again on interest rates this week. Dan, what have you been following?
Well, kicking off with a bit of good news coming out of the retail sector, and Hammerson, the UK and French shopping centre owner, they've reported its first interim profit for 4 years. They've made a profit of £50 million in the first 6 months, 2022, and that's after losses of 376 million for the same period last year. I mean, there was an article in the Chimes on Friday. Hammerson said that they'd been helped by a stabilisation in the value of the portfolio and that their fortunes had been improved and shown by a 48% increase in like-for-like net rental income, footfall at the end of the second quarter having reached 90% of the pre-pandemic level, and sales and occupancy and rent collection also improved towards pre-pandemic levels. Unibail Rodamco Westfield also reported they raised their adjusted recurring annual earnings on Thursday after first half tenant sales in continental Europe recovered post-pandemic, which was sooner than expected, but the shares of the group went up 2.1% in early trading and were one of the best performers actually on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. So, Chief Exec Jean-Marie Triton said in a statement that, they're seeing quite good, strong leasing demand, with retailers expanding with them thanks to the quality of their assets. And in fact, I actually went to go and see the new Nike store at Westfield, London this week, which was very impressive indeed. So retailers expanding, so that's good to see. Over to office space, and last week React News reported that British Land is going to partner with Allianz on its Euston Tower office building in London. In a joint venture, the project's going to have a gross development value of around £1.5 billion. But that follows BL's strategy to deliver life science space at the wider 13-acre Regent's Place estate. And there are, of course, in that neighbourhood, there's an increasing number of life science buildings, not least the Wellcome Trust's headquarters just down the street, and other academic and scientific institutions in the Knowledge Quarter nearby. Let's not forget that Euston Tower was built in 1970. Older office buildings and that fight against obsolescence, Richard, that's going to be a really, really big theme over the next few years. That life science growth story, that's all supported by a piece of research that Savills published this week. They said that take-up of life science related space hit just under 650,000 square feet at the end of the first half of 2022, and that surpasses last year's volumes. Savills looked at the core markets in Oxford, Cambridge, Greater London and the South East, White City and Central London. They anticipate a potential upside for 2022 and into 2023 as pre-let activity increases. In global stories, some of the things that have been capturing our imagination and jumping off the page have been things like the Saudi government releasing new visuals of the line up at Neom in the north of the country, which is going to be a linear city built near the Red Sea, but it's going to be a continuous structure that's going to stretch 170 kilometers across the northwest of Saudi Arabia. It's going to have mirrored facades. It's going to be 500 meters high, but only 200 meters wide. An incredible, enormous and ambitious project that's going to house up to 9 million people when it's complete. It's going to have residential, retail, leisure, schools and parks. And that project is powered entirely by renewable energy. From Riyadh to Liverpool, Peloton Real Estate and Moorfield have come together for a £100 million open storage venture. Moorfield Group and Peloton, not to be confused with the spinning bikes. They're together aiming to accumulate an initial £100 million portfolio of open storage sites. And they've already made an initial purchase of an 11-acre site in Liverpool. Open storage or outdoor storage includes sites that can be used for parking, recycling, storage, building materials, that type of thing. Nick O'Kell, investment director at Peloton, and Chris Pereira, senior investment manager at Moorfield, they're heading up that project. And lastly, the EG award shortlist has been revealed ahead of the event on 2nd of November in London. So some hotly contested entries for the judges to go through, but in particular, just following some of the categories, the global category shortlist includes the likes of AXA, M7 Real Estate, Oxford Properties and Blackstone. So we're cruising towards awards season, Richard. So one to watch.
Yeah, interesting to see what happens in terms of those awards. There seems to be a growing interest, I think, at the moment in terms of Expo Real. I don't know whether anybody else has noticed that, but certainly I'm getting more calls now about the International Investors Lounge. So just interesting to see that focus beginning to shift. Still quite a lot of activity, both in the news line, but also in terms of people planning for the autumn. Paul, what have you been tracking?
Encouraging findings from research firm MSCI, whose real assets market size report found that, contrary to some expectations, given the recent pandemic and other geopolitical factors, the size of global real estate investment market actually grew 8.5% in 2021 from $10.5 trillion in 2020 to $11.4 trillion. That's measured in US dollars, and the increase was partly offset by currency fluctuations of -3% in 2021 because the US dollar strengthened against most other currencies. Investment deals worth $2.1 trillion took place in 2021, but the firm said the main driver of the increase in the market size was asset value growth, which contributed 9.2% for standing investment. Most of the growth was attributable to the US and China. In terms of market size, though, the value of the US property market increased $466 billion to $4.1 trillion. China's a lot smaller, but increased to $791 billion. It's now the fourth largest real estate market in the world, ahead of Germany, but behind US, UK, and Japan. MSCI's head of real assets, Ronnie Veerman, stated that investors may well have expected a decline in real estate pricing, but the hit to pricing was for the most part negligible. Nevertheless, as your interview with SFO Capital Partners non-executive board member Audrey Klein highlighted, Richard, European investors at least are preoccupied with safety and are turning to more defensive asset classes. She said that prominent among these are logistics and stroke industrial and anything residential. She includes co-living, basic residential, and any offshoots, because everyone needs somewhere to live. That's certainly being borne out by what we've been seeing over the last weeks and months, including deals announced this week. Roundhill Capital closed a $200 million M&A deal to acquire 9 student housing and co-living assets in Portugal by buying purpose-built student accommodation developer and operator Smart Studios, in what is the largest deal in the sector in Portugal so far this year. We could presumably include senior living in that too, and this week Knight Frank Research also backed Audrey's assertion, as the firm found that European healthcare investment transactions increased by 17.4% in 2021, up 9 billion euros on 2020. Knight Frank said investors are increasingly looking at specific sectors within European healthcare, such as specialist care and specialist seniors housing. 3.2 billion euros was invested in senior housing and care in Europe in Q4 2021, which is the highest volume on record, and there'll be further expansion into these subsectors, the firm said. And further backing up what Audrey Klein said, there has been no shortage of logistics deals to report. Some worthy of mention: investment manager Barings is buying 8 logistics assets in the UK from NFU Mutual for £234 million. Last mile logistics specialist Vala has bought 4 assets in Lyon and Berlin, an investment of about 50 million euros, and joint venture between London headquartered Boreal IM and Cadillac Fairview has acquired a 15-asset logistics portfolio in the Netherlands from Europa Capital and its joint venture partner ARC Real Estate.
Yeah, it was interesting, that research, I think, there from Julian Evans at Knight Frank on the healthcare side. The focus on that for institutional investors continues to grow, I think. I also saw Mark's Regeneration Fund buying in Paris. There was also Can-Am looking in London for a sort of refurb, redevelopment. So interesting to see that. And as well, I noticed that on the people front, we had Brian Klinsiek, who's taking over a global research and strategy role. So congratulations to you, Brian. Really interesting. And you can see some interviews as well with Brian on Real Asset Insight. Do have a look at those. Some really interesting thought leader interviews there. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next week for our regular roundup of the real asset markets.